legal sections. I'm sure you've seen, folks, from your schedule. Now, this is necessarily going to be a little bit of an overview. So I've got 4 experts that are going to speak to us. They're going to take about 4 or 5 minutes each just to give us an overview of roughly where we are with their particular areas and what we should look out for in the very near future. So it's going to be high level, but they've got some interesting things to say just to focus our minds on some of the coming issues. So I will be very strict and leap in John, Sam, Chiara, and Kuan if you go too long. That is, me being strict, but we're looking forward to what you've got to say. We'll have about 10 minutes at the end for questions. So folks, if you have questions to any of the panelists or on any subjects in this area, try and use the Q&A bit at the bottom rather than the chat. The chat, I'm finding it difficult to keep up with the chat, so try and put something in the Q&A if you'd like to. So we're going to start on the specific area of AI. So we're going to come to Sam Silva first. Sam, well known, I think, to BCS audiences, specifically looking at the AI area of legislation. So let's start off with you, Sam, please.
Thanks, Brian, and thank you for the IT Leaders Forum for hosting us. So I think your first question, Brian, was, what are sort of the areas of immediate concern for IT leaders? So in terms of AI, I think, it's clear that there's no sort of legislation specifically dealing with AI currently. Having said that, there's clearly some aspects of the GDPR which are relevant for AI, and some of my other panelists will sort of speak about that or touch upon that. But there is no sort of specific AI legislation. But I think what IT leaders need to be aware of is there's sort of general laws which are already in place, which come into play when AI is being used. For example, if you look at the employment context, if decisions are made by AI, whether it's recruitment or appraisals and so forth, various discrimination laws will need to be considered. There's obviously a general sort of liability framework which could be either contractual or tortious, which will apply when AI does go wrong. So I think, in summary, I think it's a dangerous presumption, sort of thinking that because there's no specific AI regulation, that the use of and supply of AI will be totally unregulated. There is existing laws and principles that will apply. So that's looking at sort of immediate sort of concern. So if we're sort of looking at sort of in the future and then sort of next 12 months or so, so I'm assuming that unless we've been in total isolation, which could be a possibility given the events of the last few years, most of us will be aware or have heard of this draft AI Act, which is a piece of EU legislation. So currently it's being debated, and just in the last few days, actually, there are 2 reports from 2 different committees in the EU, which have sort of set out sort of some proposals and revised text of this AI Act. There's also another report which is scheduled to be issued in April. So the current plan, as far as I understand, is that there'll be an initial vote on this sort of AI draft regulation in November this year, but I wouldn't hold my breath. I think there's quite a long way to go, and there's a lot of debate that's currently being done. I think once this AI Act becomes enacted, it will be a game changer because it will seek to regulate AI. Now, you may think, well, why does the UK care, given it's a piece of EU legislation? I think the problem is that, if UK companies are intending to supply AI in Europe, that the Act will apply. So that's the AI Act in a nutshell of what's happening. The other thing we need to be aware of, the Law Commission recently released a report about changing the liability framework for AI in autonomous vehicles. So if you're in the sector supplying sort of software or hardware in the sort of autonomous vehicle sector, or if you're procuring certain solutions for use in your manufacturing your car, that is something that you need to consider. Again, that's a proposal by the Law Commission. Whether that'll be enacted as specific legislation, we'll only probably know in the next, I guess, 6 to 12 months. So that's it. I hope I kept to time, Brian.
Actually, you very much did, Sam. Thank you very much. Excellent. So that's a cracking start. Now we're going to turn over now to Kuan Hon. Kuan works for Dentons. Her particular areas are the data protection and security sort of angle. So Kuan, over to you, please. The same sort of approach, as you know.
Hi, Brian. Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. I will cover UK now and next, and then EU now and next. So on the data protection front, I saw somebody had asked an issue about ethics and bias and discrimination. Actually, under the GDPR, which we have in the UK, there are requirements for fairness and transparency in processing. There are requirements about automated decision making. And of course, never mind about ethics, under the law, you can be fined. You can be ordered to stop whatever you're doing, which could be very operationally disruptive. There's been more enforcement in the EU than in the UK. But for example, some of you might remember that HMRC a few years ago was ordered to stop using the voice prints of about 5 million taxpayers for authentication. And of course, that's AI. So moving on to some other aspects in the UK, a lot of people haven't heard of the NIS regulations, as far as I know, which is about the security of network and information systems, and that is law now. And the focus is on business continuity and resilience. So there are security requirements and incident reporting obligations on operators of essential services, basically critical infrastructure, also cloud services, including scalable SaaS and online marketplaces. And since last year, potentially, there's a maximum fine of £17 million for serious outages. So, you know, this is actually quite important. And there's been little publicity about that, but, you know, potentially big fines for that. And of course, with the current geopolitical situation, there's an increased threat of nation state sponsored sophisticated attacks. Another aspect I wanted to mention in relation to security is the National Security and Investment Act. And that came in January, and the penalties include criminal convictions with imprisonment and fines of up to £10 million, or 5% worldwide turnover of hire. And basically, this law requires telling the UK government about acquiring certain entities in 17 areas of the economy, which are considered particularly sensitive, that operate in the UK, reaching certain thresholds. And this includes advanced robotics, AI, communications, computing hardware, cryptographic authentication, critical suppliers to government, data infrastructure, energy, defense, military, quantum technology, satellites, space tech. I mean, you know, it's a lot. So certain acquisitions do have to be notified if they meet certain thresholds to the authorities. They could block those acquisitions for national security, or even say, you know, we're going to stop this and you have to reverse it. So those are the main kind of things that are in now. And if we're talking about the future in the UK, good news for UK organisations is that the UK government consulted on reforming the data protection legislation last year. It wants to take a more practical risk-based approach, less red tape, or as they put it, pro-growth and innovation friendly. And by the way, I'm on the UK government's International Data Transfer Expert Council, which is a kind of sounding board on the approach to transfers of personal data outside the UK. But the government has indicated in its benefits of Brexit document in January that it's going to be publishing its response to this consultation in spring this year, and will be introducing legislation to reform the UK's data protection regime and hopefully make it more practical. So, you know, watch out for that this spring, summer. The UK is also planning to issue new laws to security measures for UK public telecoms networks and service providers. And it's consulting on that at the moment, ending in May. So, you know, more security laws. Now, previously I mentioned the NIS regulations regarding cloud and infrastructure, critical infrastructure providers. The UK government plans to extend this to managed service providers. So some of you might well be managed service providers, and you will be in scope if the UK does this, and also broaden the requirement to notify incidents. You know, this is so you know, expanding the scope of security requirements. Then there's a product security and telecoms infrastructure bill, which some people may have heard of. And basically for consumer IoT, internet connected products, if you make or sell these products, then there will be requirements regarding default passwords, the period for which security updates are available, vulnerability reporting systems. And again, there are fines if there are breaches. But this is, this is going through at the moment. It's not law yet.
Kuan,
So
can I give you a 1 minute?
No, exactly. Moving on to
you.
the EU, I mentioned there are AI-related fines relating to data protection. This is mainly about biometrics, fingerprints, facial recognition, and also automated decision-making regarding rideshare or delivery drivers. There are also issues about transfers out of the EU and analytics and, the dead US Privacy Shield, issues regarding ad tech for those of you in that space regarding the IAB TCF, and certainly competition investigations on ad tech, both in the EU and the UK. In the future, on the AI front, the EU is planning laws to protect gig economy platform workers, including rights regarding algorithmic management. There's going to be investigations on cloud use by the public sector. There will be a NIS2, which will broaden the scope of the NIS directive, including data centers and GDPR level fines, and loads of other legislation on security, like a proposed directive on resilience of critical entities, Digital Operational Resilience Act for the financial sector, and so on, are all going to be going through. So lots on the horizon.
Thank you, Kuan. That was a very interesting. Thank you very much. So let's look at non-personal data in the EU. This is Chiara's going to come in here. Chiara Rustici, and I don't know if you're at the top of a mountain now, Chiara, but if you are, we look forward to hearing from you.
I'm fine. Can you hear me?
We can, thank you.
Excellent. So I'll go forward. Right. If your head is spinning, you're not alone. Even lawyers struggle to keep up, and even analysts who do this full time struggle to keep up. So best line I can give you, Brian, and everybody in the IT Leaders Forum, is that you'll do yourself a favor if you start looking at data not as a pure science, but as the latest regulated industry. If you switch to that mindset, you'll firstly, you'll understand you need to become friends with your legal team in whichever corporate you are. And secondly, it just becomes part of your job to become familiar with regulations coming down the pipeline. It just isn't a pure science. So I'm going to use a couple of magic words. When I say enforce, that a regulation or piece of law is enforced, means act now. You may be behind the curve. When I use a magic word, adopted but not yet enforced or not yet enforceable, that means that you can catch up, that you have time to benefit from business opportunities from this new regulation, or simply become compliant. And then if it's proposed, that's your chance to influence the direction of the legislative efforts. I'm going to look outside the United Kingdom. I'm going to look at Europe and China. And most of all, I'm going to look at firstly at public sector data. This is a recent trend in the European policy space, where they want to make open data work for everybody. And this, of course, means business for anybody, not just Europeans. So the Open Data Directive, this is already in force. So you can, you've got to be fast to catch up. It applies to high value data sets that are created by public sector bodies as part of their day-to-day operation, or research data that results from public funding. The idea being that the legislator, European Union, wants to remedy that inconsistent quality, different licensing models, bad metadata that, curse open data sets, and you know all about this. So to make reuse and discoverability of open data set easy, data providers, both inside and within government entities, must ensure interoperability, shared semantics and syntax characteristic, common structure, common metadata, vocabulary standards, and cataloging. Quality, readability, completeness, accuracy recency, and regular updating. So essentially, the Open Data Directive is going to mandate that public data sets be interoperable and reshareable. This typically applies to geospatial data sets like weather data, population data. It does not apply to public data sets that are under rights of others, like intellectual property. If somebody has intellectual property rights over these data sets, or there are commercial or statistical confidentiality issues or data protection issues, then this directive doesn't cover them, but there's another act that covers that. This is not yet in force, but it has been agreed in its final form. So you're in time here. And this is the Data Governance Act, European Data Governance Act. So again, it wants to encourage fair principles to facilitate the reuse of government-held data for commercial and non-commercial purposes. And it creates, and this is the interesting bit, it creates two types of new actors to mediate data transactions. One, don't laugh, they're actually called non-profit data altruism entities. So entities that share data not for profit. And the other type is commercial data sharing service providers. So that's commercial opportunities there. So if you think about the early stages of COVID-19 pandemic, European governments did not have a workable legal framework for hospitals to obtain public health data for research purposes. That was a massive, massive hole. And this Data Governance Act wants precisely to encourage this. So public sector data sets, which may have IP, confidentiality, or data protection issues, but still must be reusable. So that's balancing out between reusability and data protection.
Chiara, half a minute, please, if you would.
Half a minute. Okay, fantastic. The thing that you're still in time to work on, to contribute to, is the Data Act regulation. This has been proposed only, it's not in a final stage, so you can comment and feedback to the European Commission your ideas. And this is, if you want the answer to the eternal question, who owns data? If you remember, the GDPR does not talk about possession, does not about property rights of personal data. It just talks about control by the individual over their data. Now, the Data Act regulation is even bigger than the GDPR. So remember how much work went into getting to grips with this. Double it. Data Act regulation applies to personal and non-personal generated data, which means IoT connected device data. And it's there to regulate who has the right to commercialize or benefit from the data. Is it the manufacturer of the connected device? Is it the supplier of the connected device? Is it the end user? So what is the third party reuse regime data for IoT data? That's what the Data Act regulation is trying to answer, and you're still in time to feedback your ideas. Thank you, Brian, and thank you everybody for inviting me.
Thank you, Chiara. We've had a couple of questions in. We'll come on to those at the end. But before that, we're going to listen to John Enser. John's particular area is media. I don't know if he's going to mention Spotify, but we'll see. Over to you, John. Thank you.
No, I wasn't going to mention Spotify other than in passing. Thank you, Brian. Yeah, no, my focus is really on how every business these days is a media business, because we're all communicating with each other and sharing content, and how all of us need to worry about how we are going to get caught up in the side sweep of the change in flavor of regulation of the internet that's we are in the middle of at the moment. So if I can portray this in very simplistic terms, for the last 20 years, the big beasts of the internet, search engines, ISPs, and so on, have had a relatively soft pass in terms of regulation. They've been seen as being quite well protected. And now that's all changing. And now that's all changing, and it's being driven by disinformation, it's being driven by child protection. You know, pick your topic. Everything is changing, and everything has a focus on, you know, the big boys, the Googles, the Facebooks, the Metas of the world. And so there is some new legislation coming down which is specifically aimed at those platforms who have more than 45 million monthly active users. I suspect not many of you in the room are in that bucket, and if you are, you probably know a lot about this anyway. What I'm interested in is the collateral damage that is going to be caused by everybody else, because everybody else who has any kind of online interaction platform is going to be caught in the crossfire. So there are various pieces of legislation coming down the track that deal with this. First of all, we've got video sharing providers. They're the first up to be regulated in Europe and the UK. So that's your obvious people like YouTube, but it also includes people like Twitch. The next layer down is that sort of platform regulation is being swept much broader. And it's happening in Europe through something called the Digital Services Act, and it's happening in the UK through something called the Online Safety Bill. Now, you may all have heard of the Online Safety Bill. If you haven't, you should be worrying, because it gives everybody increased responsibility for online content that is going over their networks. There are new obligations around transparency. There are new rules about online advertising and transparency, and how you have to make it clearer that things are being dealt with. You've got to do due diligence in certain instances about the people who you're allowing on your platform, and you've got to do a whole lot of things around child protection. Don't have time to go into the detail of much of that, but this is not about just the big boys. If you have, you know, comment boards on a website, you're going to be caught by this potentially. It really goes down to anybody who is doing any kind of business online where they have a marketplace that allows them to share ideas or trade or communication with anybody else. Yes, the big boys have very specific regulation that's applying to them, and that's an opportunity for everybody else, because it hopefully levels up the playing field so that it will no longer be the case that Google and Facebook and Amazon have all of the advertising between them. But there is the collateral damage that everybody else is going to be subjected to these increasing regulations. And they include not only the sort of GDPR style fines that people have been talking about, but also criminal offences. And why do we have criminal offences? Because Boris Johnson made a slip up during PMQs and started talking about criminal offences, and you could see all the civil servants go, "Oh my God, we haven't had criminal offences in here before." So watch this space. We're due to have the proper draft. We've had a consultation process. We're due to have the proper draft of the Online Services Bill in the UK in the next few weeks or months. The European process is a bit further down the line. And now I will hand back to Brian so we can move into the next phase.
Thank you, John. That was very interesting. We appreciate your coverage there. I've noticed that our panelists have been answering questions as we've gone on the chat. So brilliant. Thanks very much for that. There's a couple have come in that I'd like to just share generally. Sam, first one to you. I've had a query come in about the fact that as AI is often trained on what we call training data, should we expect there to be legislation coming in to audit where that training data's come from, and bearing in mind the effect that can have on bias and so on?
Yeah, potentially, although it's interesting, there was a report which was issued, I think, maybe a few weeks ago, which meant that there was a technical deficiency in the AI Act, and it didn't cover all basically AI systems which learned without training systems, i.e. it was learning itself, the way it was drafted. So it's quite a technical sort of nuance there, but there is criticism saying that a whole raft of AI wouldn't be regulated because of the way that the act was drafted. So whether that gets remedied or not is another thing. Presumably it would, because otherwise, you will be carving out a whole raft of AI, which is intended to be covered. But yeah, I don't know whether that was an intentional omission or whether it was a drafting deficiency.
Okay, well, that's interesting. Thank you. That's two examples of interesting possible mistakes that might have affected legislation after John's one. John, there's a question just in the general chat about whether any engagement or feedback on a website or an app would be captured by the things that you were talking about.
Not all. Unhelpful answer is some of them, but not all of them. So if you have, for example, feedback on Amazon, if you've got feedback on an Amazon site about a product, then that would be caught. If you just have something that is purely editorial, because there are obviously free speech aspects to this as well. If you have something that's a purely editorial type content, so I don't know, I'm a rugby fan, I sometimes chat on rugby apps, and is that going to be caught? Almost certainly not, unless I'm allowed to, if I'm allowed to post video content, then certainly some of the obligations around child protection and so on would kick in. But frankly, most sites and services don't allow people to post anything other than text, because already the reputational issues around letting people post that stuff are just in the too difficult bucket. So so in most instances, if it's a purely editorial thing, not. But if it's sales related or if it's product related, then you may well be caught. And we're yet, that's in the Europe legislation. We're yet to see the final version of the UK legislation. So who knows?
Okay, good. So watch this space, which is true of a lot of the things we're talking about, I think, isn't it?
It is, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you, John. A question here, I think this is for Chiara, really. Mike Broomhead just says, I missed why geodata has to be public, i.e. the name of the EU-UK legislation. Did you pick that up?
Okay, yes, I can go back on that very quickly. It's about making public data work for the data economy. Essentially, we pay already taxes for public sector to produce whatever service they're producing, and there could be, exhaust data that's there as a result of their day-to-day operation. So why not make that data accessible to private actors, the companies, individuals, researchers, but also businesses, so that they can